Operation Wendigo. Operation Wendigo was enacted in 2013 by the FBI due to the National Park Ranger Service reporting the highest cases of missing and/or attacked campers by creatures in the woods. Normally, the FBI gets reports of incidents in the national parks when something of significance happened, like the National Park Skinwalker incident, which was recently declassified. The names of the cases do not necessarily reflect actual events in the case, but rather what has been reported to us by the park rangers, most of which are dramatically created, mainly to show the level of severity of the case. Anyways, sorry for the preface. My name is Agent Johnson, and I was assigned to Operation Wendigo with my partner, Agent Borski, back in November. Agent Borski is rather new to the Bureau and hasn't been hardened by the cruel nature of the job. Borski is a religious man, I believe, which is perfectly fine, yet I have found that to become an issue in the past with other cases. We are not the first agents on this case. They didn't tell us how many sets of agents they had before, but we are able to look at the case file to see all the previous notes and logs. Most of the time looking at case notes, there is a slight disconnect between each different sets of agents, as you would suspect, since not everyone looks at things the same way. Agent Borski and I are driving to the national park early one November morning, and he's reviewing the case notes aloud while I'm driving. It appears that in July of 2013, there have been 12 missing persons and 37 reports of animal attacks in just this park alone. That's essentially an attack a day. That level of attacks is extremely strange, but it gets weirder. Some of the reports of the creature, not animal, was that it was bipedal and it had claws. All of the attacks were at night, so the victims were not able to get a better description than that. It didn't give us much to work off of, but Borski and I were able to make assumptions on the case. I do not believe in the paranormal, nor am I religious. I believe that everything has a scientific or at least a logical explanation. My guess, based on my experience, was that this was either a cult or a human trafficking ring hiding in the park and covering up the abductions as people going missing in the park. Borski nodded at my assumption, but I could tell that there was something in his mind suggesting that there was more to this case than what science could explain. You know, every year we do find an animal that we had no idea existed, Borski said. They're mainly smaller species, but every now and then we do find a large one. I glanced over to Borski, taking my attention off the road for a brief moment to give him a skeptical look. Do you think that there's an unknown animal attacking these campers that we don't know about? I said with extreme skepticism. My question brought Borski back to reality, but not all the way. Well, you never know, he said. He continued reading the case file, although silently, and would every now and then share something interesting. Ooh, look at this. There's been reports of ghost sightings as well, he said with excitement. My eyes practically rolled out of my head. Ghost sightings? Really? Every place is haunted depending on who you ask, I said with a smile. Borski continued reading silently the entire way to the park, and we met up with some of the park rangers. We pulled into the ranger station, and we were greeted by 2 rangers. It was late in the afternoon, so we had a good couple of hours before we called it a day. We asked to be filled in on what they knew about the situation. Unfortunately, they knew very little since the park rangers were instructed not to talk about anything that happened in the park. I glanced at the rangers and noticed that their uniforms were typical, but that they were carrying rifles. Whoa boys, quite the firepower you got there, I said. Well, this is bear country, and I am sure you're aware of our missing persons numbers as of late, they responded. They walked us inside of the ranger station, and we met with all the other rangers. They were also equally useless to us in terms of information, since no one really had an idea what was going on. We were then informed that there had been an attack that morning, and that we were able to join them in their investigation, if we wished. We joined them and rode down to the campsite in one of the rangers' jeeps. We arrived at the site, but everything else had been roped off. The site had 2 small camping trailers parked next to each other. One of the trailers had been knocked over, and both had large claw marks on the doors and sides. What happened here? Said Borski. Well, it looks like we had another bear attack last night. These people probably left some food out and the bears did the rest, said the ranger. I was amazed at this damage. Bears will attack people, but they will avoid it if it is possible. The bears probably figured that there was food inside, but I've never seen a bear so persistent enough to knock over a camping trailer to do so. Are there any survivors? I asked. I was met with a solemn headshake. How many do we figure were camping here? I asked. Looks like 10 campers, responded the ranger. 10 campers? There's no way a bear or even a couple of bears would eat 10 campers in one attack. Our options are that there's either something menacing in these woods, or that this was a cover-up. I was beginning to be envious of the rangers and their additional firepower. I wasn't getting spooked, but something about this and what I was looking at was making me uneasy. We walked up to the campsite to see that most of the bodies were either taken by the alleged bears, or that the paramedics had already gotten them. There wasn't much for us to see other than the blood and claw marks. The blood was everywhere. I had been on many cases where there were fatalities and even where I killed some people, but none of that compares to what I was looking at. There were parts of the trailer that had been so bloodied that it began to pool in small puddles. We checked the locks on the door, which indeed were locked, but it appeared that the door frame of the trailer gave in, allowing whatever intruder to enter. National parks do not allow guns of any kind, so these campers were literally fish in a barrel with nowhere to go. I was beginning to doubt my trafficker's theory due to the carnage that laid before me. Typically, traffickers want to traffic people that aren't harmed, or at least not dead. Whatever had happened here didn't seem to care whether or not people had died. We left the crime scene after conducting a small investigation, which only resulted in us documenting the claw marks on the trailer. The trailer was made of a somewhat thin sheet metal, but even then, I'm unaware of any kind of bear that can do that. Perhaps I don't know enough about bears. We rode back to the station with some of the rangers, and I was glancing around the park, admiring the beauty. I was trying to take my mind off of what I'd just seen, and this was doing the trick. The park nestled up to this beautiful mountain that had snow on top of it. It was November and it was chilly out, but snow had yet to fall. As I was admiring the landscape, something caught my eye. It was the color yellow that popped out from the lush green forest. I focused on the color to see what appeared to be a small child wearing something yellow off in the distance. It caught my attention, but I thought nothing of it. We made it back to the ranger station, and the sun had a good ways to go before setting. However, the rangers were already closing up the station. Wait, why are you guys closing up? Aren't you guys supposed to be open at all hours? I was then informed, due to recent events of the campers being attacked at night, that they have set a curfew for both rangers and campers that no one was allowed outside after dark. We were given the option to stay at the station, stay in town, or there was a fire tower a few miles in the forest that wasn't occupied by anyone during this time of year. Borsky and I looked at each other, and we both nodded. We'll take the fire tower, I said. Borsky and I, both being of a detective mindset, knew that since no one would be at the fire tower, that we could investigate at night, without interruption. That would be the only way to really get answers. The rangers escorted us out to the fire tower, and to my surprise, the fire tower was quite large. It reached over the tops of the trees. They dropped us off and we hiked up the stairs. The stairs had an interesting feature that you could retract the first 15 steps, much like the ladder on one's attic. The inside of the fire station was quite impressive, having not been used in a few months. There were 3 beds, a small stove, and a table with a few chairs around it. We didn't have much stuff other than our packs and our case notes. Granted, being an FBI field agent, we were already carrying our equipment that we needed to investigate. Once we put our stuff down, we climbed back down the stairs and started walking in a random direction that hopefully would lead us to a campsite. Our walk would prove pointless, as most of the campsites were empty. We didn't know if this was because of the off-season, or if that campers knew what was happening. We walked a good mile or so, and we eventually found an old-looking trailer parked at one of the campsites. As we walked over to the trailer, I saw a yellow flash again. I looked over and saw the small girl standing about 50 yards away. She was just standing there, looking at us. I waved to the little girl, and me and Borsky walked over to the trailer. The trailer was old, and the tires that supported it were flat. Not a good sign. We knocked on the trailer, and we didn't get a response. Granted, it was getting dark, and there was a really good possibility that this trailer was abandoned. We left the trailer and went back to where we saw the girl, but she was gone. Our options were either to continue down this now darkening trail to find the girl, or head back to the fire tower. I glanced at my watch to see that it was about 7:30 p.m., but the trees were already blocking much of what was left of daylight. We decided to head back and come back tomorrow with some of the rangers. We hiked back, and by this time, it was pitch dark out. The sun had completely set, and the trees seemed to add a layer of thick darkness that would swallow the light of our flashlights. It was probably a good idea that we turned around when we did. We went up the stairs to the fire station, and we retracted the first 15 steps, much like the attic stairs I had mentioned earlier. We obviously did this to prevent any unwelcome guests from coming up the stairs while we slept. To be completely honest, having seen the campsite earlier, it actually bothered me to where I'd actually feared for the first time in the field in a long time. We reached the top of the fire station, and due to our brief yet tiresome hike, we fell asleep rather quickly. I dreamt that night of something rather horrific. I dreamt that I was in the woods alone, walking down the path that we saw the small child on. I could feel eyes all around me, and a strong presence of evil. I continued down the path until I came across something hunched over in the middle of the trail. I didn't have a flashlight, but I could still see in the dark to a degree. The thing hunched down seemed to be eating something. I could hear the crunching and tearing of bone and tissue. My legs didn't move, but I could feel myself getting closer. The creature from behind looked very similar to a human, if it wasn't for the antlers on its head. Its back was pale, its muscles looked dried and withered, as if you left meat in the freezer for too long. I was now close enough to see that the creature was eating Agent Borsky. Borsky was still alive and thrashing around in pain, although the creature easily kept him down with one hand. My fear overcame me, and rather than helping Borsky, I tried to run, but I couldn't. I think this notified the creature, and it stopped eating Borsky to look at me. The creature's face was completely human, although its ears, lips, and nose had withered off its body and were no longer there. It bore yellowish fangs, and its eyes were blood red. Its claws were large and rugged, unlike that of a bear or a tiger. I could now understand the damage of the two trailers from earlier. The creature stood up and swiped at my throat, but before it could land its killing blow, I woke up inside of the fire station. When I woke, I was covered in sweat. I was completely terrified. I glanced over to Borsky, and he was asleep. Something outside caught my eye, and I could see outside the window that there was something just outside of our door. I grabbed my gun and my flashlight, shined my light outside to see a familiar flash of yellow. I went to the door and opened it, and saw the girl in yellow now starting to go down the stairs. How was this possible? How did she get up the stairs since we removed the first couple of steps? I was baffled. I tried talking to her, but she just kept moving. I shouted to Borsky and told him that he needed to wake up and follow me. He groaned and began to get up, and I followed the girl down the steps. I couldn't ever get a good look at her. Whenever I would shine my light directly at her, she would completely disappear, only to appear a few more feet ahead of where she once stood. I knew that something about this was unlike any experience I had ever had, and that I had no explanation on what was going on. Borsky finally caught up to me, and I told him that I think that this girl we're following is a ghost. I couldn't see his face, but I knew that his eyes were wide and that he believed me. She then led us down the dark trail. Even though it was dark and we didn't know where we were going, I felt comforted, as if I was being led by someone I could trust, and that I was in good hands. She ended up leading us a good distance away, down an old path that didn't look used anymore. The path was barely noticeable, even having a guide to show us where it was. The trail was completely overgrown. Borsky and I had to push through in order to follow the girl. We walked what I would guess to be 5 miles down this path, but it was probably more like 2. The weeds and brush made it very difficult to get anywhere, and we had no idea how we were going to get back. The girl finally stopped and pointed at what appeared to be a very old cabin. The girl would no longer disappear when I shined my light at her, and I noticed that her dress to be very out of date. She looked as if she was once a pioneer of some kind. Her skin was pale and her eyes were dark. Although I knew I was looking at a ghost, I wasn't afraid. She never said anything, but just pointed at the cabin. Borsky and I knew that asking her questions would be pointless, and that whatever questions we had would be answered by entering the cabin. We shined our lights on the cabin and saw that it was not of this time. We looked back at the girl to see that she had disappeared. We pressed on the cabin door, which gave us much resistance, but eventually squeaked open. Inside, we could see what appeared to be a family cabin. There were still plates on the table and an old makeshift furniture placed around the room. I saw an old musket that must have been the late 1800s. As I was admiring the rifle, I noticed an engraving on the butt of the gun. Jeremiah, it said. Borsky called me over and shined his light to a place on the floor next to the fireplace. The floor was stained with a dark reddish brown, and it was next to a yellow dress, much like the one we saw on the girl. After a quick investigation, inside the fireplace we were able to find small but human bones. What happened here? Borsky said. I paused and used my detective mind while putting together what I knew about some of the pioneers. I have heard of pioneers getting snowed in or not having enough food back in those days, and were forced to make a difficult decision to survive. Borsky, I think someone ate this girl. We checked the plates on the table, and unfortunately it did confirm my theory. The bones on the plates were small human bones. As we came to this conclusion, we heard a sound outside. It sounded as if something large was pushing itself through the overgrown brush with great speed, as if we found something that someone did not want us to see. We quickly ran to the door and locked it with the old locks, yet still working. The cabin did have old and somewhat opaque windows, yet we could still see shapes through it. The door began to shake violently, which shook the entire cabin. A creature then broke a window and tried to enter through it, but it was too large to fit. We could now see that the creature resembled that thing I saw in my dreams. It was tall, and it looked withered and pale. Its head had antlers, and its face lacked features. Borsky and I opened fire on the creature, which appeared to harm the creature, causing it to panic. While trying to enter the window, one of its antlers got stuck inside the window. The creature tried frantically to remove its large head from the window, but it was stuck. Borsky and I fired most of our ammo, but I told him to wait. Seeing now that this creature couldn't move, I walked over to it. I picked up the old rifle and pointed to the name on it, saying, "Jeremiah?" The creature looked at me with knowing eyes. It clearly recognized the name. "What did you do?" I said to the creature. The creature's panic had stopped, and it sat there as if it was in shame. It let out a growl, and a low, gravelly voice said, "We were hungry." I then lifted my pistol and shot the creature in the eye. The back of its head came off, and a thick, dark liquid splattered the inside of the cabin. The creature then spasmed before laying lifeless in the window. Whatever this thing was, it was clearly dead. I took the bones from inside, as well as the yellow dress, and dug a small grave with an old shovel I found inside. I placed the bones on the dress inside and covered the small grave with dirt. Borsky and I left the creature in the window and made our way back to the ranger station. At this time the sun was beginning to rise. We could hear the birds chirping, and we felt a sense of dread lift from the forest. We finally made it back to the station, and we were greeted by some of the rangers. We told them rather confidently that we had single-handedly solved the missing persons problem. They looked at us confused, and we all hopped into the jeep. We showed them the hidden trail that led to the cabin, but to our horror and dismay, the creature that we had recently killed was no longer in the window. It was missing. It was right there, guys. I'm telling you. It had these big antlers and claws. The rangers nodded their head as if they'd seen this before. In fact, they didn't even seem remotely surprised. "We know, fellows. Apparently legend has it, if you eat another human, you turn into those things." I then recalled what the creature said to me before I killed it. We were hungry. We. More than one. "Borsky, how many plates are on the table?" He went inside and quickly confirmed what I had feared. "There's 5 plates. It wasn't just Jeremiah that ate this girl. It was a whole family. There are more of these things out there." Operation Wendigo, Part 2. After relaying the information back to headquarters, Agent Borsky and I were relieved from the case. Borsky was reassigned to another case and I went on leave. The events that had happened over the short time had really stuck with me. I started developing severe anxiety. I couldn't sleep at night, and my eating habits were off. The worst part, I'd have to say, about all of it, were the dreams. For whatever the reason, I couldn't stop reliving those events of that night in my dreams. Except every time I would dream about it, things would slightly change. Change for the worst. Each and every dream since has both been hyper-realistic and incredibly dark. The endings of the dreams would greatly vary, to which every time we would lose to a horrible death, I would either get decapitated or eviscerated, all while my partner Borsky would watch, helplessly. After seeing many doctors and specialists, I resorted to basically anyone that could possibly help me. After spending thousands of dollars and basically receiving no results, I was basically forced to go anywhere. One day, I had to take my car down to the mechanic in the less desirable part of town. While I was down there, I couldn't help but notice only a few blocks away, there was a fortune teller. I had a couple of hours for my vehicle to get repaired, and I was genuinely just curious as to what kind of information they could share. Upon entering the dimly lit building, I couldn't help but notice all of the weird decorations that littered the building. It looked like an old Halloween shop from the 70s. I almost left, but I had this weird feeling. A feeling of forbidden knowledge about to be acquired. My hair on my neck stood on end. Out of the back room, an old woman wearing a ton of adornments came out. She beckoned me to follow her, which I did. She led me back to another room that was even more dark and even more grotesque with decorations. In the center of the dimly lit room was a table that had a glass orb on top of it. She sat me down at the table and she sat at the other side. To my surprise, she moved the glass orb, just regarding it, and grabbed my hands. Her hands were old and wrinkly and had a leathery texture to them. Now that I could get a better look at the woman, I happened to notice that her eyes were completely white. Either she was literally blind, or she was wearing contacts for effect. Nonetheless, it was still startling. "You haven't been sleeping," shrilled the old woman while still holding my hands. Yeah, I haven't." She grasped my hands tighter and started to sway back and forth. "You have done things to the dark forces." I paused. I was caught off guard. What do you mean? What dark forces? "You have taken one of their own, and they want payment." There's no way that this woman could have known what had happened. That mission was classified. There wasn't even a report in the news. Instead of confronting this woman on how she knew this information, I just remained quiet. "The dark forces will continue to plague you until you make things right." "How do I fix it? How do I make it right?" The woman let out a cackle that much resembled that of a witch. "To fix what you have done, you must go to their dimension." "And how do I do that? And what do I do once I'm there?" "Well, there are many ways to enter. A doorway or stairs, even a mirror could lead you there. But what to do when you're there is the question. That is for you to decide." The enchantment of the old woman had worn off in my mind. I was now no longer curious and rather frustrated. Much like the other options before, trying to find solutions to my issues, this avenue had led me to a dead end. I didn't know what the rate was for this fortune teller. I'd been with her for about maybe 5 minutes, so I left a $20 bill on the table. I got up and I left. The woman didn't say anything when I left. She didn't protest. I assumed that the payment was adequate, and that was that. I was able to go back to the garage, get my car, and go home. Later on that day, I got a bizarre call. It was from the Bureau. They didn't go into a lot of detail, but they said it was regarding the Operation Wendigo case.
Despite all of my issues and the disorders that I've gained from that case, I agreed to meet up and at least listen to what was going on. The next day I headed down to the headquarters, again having another terrible night's sleep the night prior. After having a quick mission briefing, I soon discovered that most if not all agents that they've deployed to this case had recently gone missing. That included active and inactive agents. I asked about Agent Borsky and if he was still around. They declined to share his specific assignment, but they told me that he was doing well. They said that ever since Borsky and I left the case, ever since we killed that creature, that things have gone 10 times worse, with the other field agents either disappearing or not wanting to take the case. They really had no options. The mission director offered that if I took the case, that he would double my salary, and that I could ask for anything to help assist in this case. Knowing that I had unlimited resources, and a double salary was a nice touch. But in all honesty, I wanted to do this for me, to be able to get my sanity back. I made the choice, and probably the mistake, to accept the case. I listed my demands for the case and the resources that I would need, as well as the personnel. The mission director immediately accepted. After a week of prepping and training my team, we finally headed back to where it all started. I personally requested 2 SWAT teams and 1 tech team. All in all, I was in charge of about 20 people, something that I wasn't necessarily accustomed to. However, when you're in the Bureau, leadership comes naturally, mainly because everyone just listens to what you say. We finally arrived to the national park, and to my surprise, it had been completely deserted. There were no forest rangers, there were no campers, and everything had been blocked off. This was definitely for the best. Those people would have just gotten in our way. To be honest, this was more of a military exercise than anything. The vehicles that we brought with us were heavy duty. I specifically requested heavy duty so whatever was out here couldn't easily enter. We had about 4 pickup trucks, 2 trailers, and 1 large cargo van. Obviously this is a bit of an overkill, but safety was top priority. We parked all of our stuff in a circle. The front entrance to the state park was closed, so we had to enter by foot. The first thing that we wanted to investigate was the forest station. We wanted to see if it was inhabitable or if there was anything we could do to reinforce it while we stayed here. I anticipated the forest station to be inoperable, and after a quick investigation with both SWAT teams, that appeared to be the case. My initial thought of investigating the forest station was that it would be covered with bodies, but thankfully it just looked to be abandoned. I ordered a quick inspection of the facility. I asked them to look for any weak points and, most importantly, if they felt safe staying there. They came back to me later on saying that the facility looked fine, they were just worried about the windows, to which I agreed. We ended up just setting up camp on the side of the road, outside of the national park. Obviously, this wasn't the most ideal situation, however, it appeared to be the safest. I did my best to brief my team on what to expect out in these woods. Despite the professionalism and the severity of what was going on, I could still tell that they were doubting me. Granted, the things that I said I wish weren't true. Nonetheless, the fact remained that there were still 4 Wendigos out in these woods. The plan was fairly simple. Kill the remaining Wendigos. Granted, that's easier said than done, but still, we had to try. I was going to have the SWAT teams investigate the cabin and hopefully find some clues. My tech team was going to set up cameras all throughout the forest. Hopefully we'd find something. I didn't share this with the team, but the events earlier with me and the fortune teller still stayed in my mind. I was still looking for some kind of portal, something that would lead us to another dimension. Nighttime eventually fell, and I had my teams get prepped for the coming investigation. We would do the majority of our investigation during the night. That would be the only way that we'd get actual results, however dangerous it might be. My tech team had all afternoon to set up cameras throughout the entire forest, at least places we thought we'd see activity. Night fell and my teams got ready. I readied up with one of my SWAT teams when I was recommended to stay back. I then remembered that I was the mission leader. I probably shouldn't be doing anything dangerous. I agreed and I stayed back. I told my SWAT team that I wanted them to investigate the cabin, the one that Borsky and I investigated, to see if they could find any more clues. I had the first SWAT team to go investigate, while I had the other set to stay back and protect us. Both sets of SWAT teams were outfitted with body cameras, that way we could see what they saw. The first SWAT team drove a good portion of the way into the national park, when they saw a large structure blocking the road. At first, I hadn't recognized it, since it wasn't standing upright. But after a few seconds, I soon remembered that that was the fire tower that me and Borsky stayed in. It had fallen over. Since it was blocking the road, my first SWAT team was forced to get out of their truck and walk the rest of the way. I asked them to investigate briefly the fire tower, see what might have caused it to fall over. If memory served correctly, the fire tower's base was made of wood. I wanted them to see if there was any cracking of the wood of any kind. Perhaps high winds might have caused it to fall over, as unlikely as that sounds. I could see on their body cameras distorted images of the base. The poles that stood upright looked like they'd been chewed through or slashed at. Just from seeing this alone, I could tell that my first SWAT team was starting to take this more seriously. I then ordered the SWAT team to investigate the actual building itself to see what remained of the inside. In the actual building part of the tower, the SWAT team was able to discover 3 bodies of federal agents that were investigating the case. We were able to discover that the 3 bodies were indeed missing agents. Right then and there, I made a satellite phone call to my supervisor telling him what we found. I requested an ambulance to recover the bodies. Upon the request, they asked me if I needed more backup, to which I declined. That was the entirety of the phone call, and I went back to watching the monitors to see what my first SWAT team was doing. They continued hiking into the woods to the coordinates that I'd given them for the cabin. After 30 minutes or so, they finally arrived. I could tell just from the body cameras alone that my SWAT team was quite frantic. They were looking around quite frequently, as if multiple things were catching their attention. I radioed in, "SWAT Team 1, what's the situation?" It took them a few seconds to reply, but when they finally did, they said, sorry, we keep hearing things off in the woods. It sounds like there are multiple." My heart skipped a beat upon hearing this. I asked them to get to the cabin quickly and set up defenses. Before any of them could respond, I started to hear gunfire. Oh, great, I thought. We continued to monitor the body cameras as it appeared that they were firing into the woods. I told them to hold their fire and just get to the cabin. They should be somewhat safe there. A small portion of the SWAT team's cameras had shut off, which made us fear the worst. The SWAT team leader radioed in. "It appears that we lost 2 SWAT members. Should we return back?" My SWAT team of 6 is now down to 4. Great. I told them that the cabin wasn't too far away. If they could make it there, we'd send a rescue team in to help them out. I told them that I'd personally come in myself to help them. I was prepping the second team when my tech team told me something surprising had happened on one of the monitors. One of the SWAT members that had gone missing, his camera had turned back on. The images from the camera revealed many disturbing things. First and foremost was that of an apparent Wendigo. Despite it being through camera, even the image of it still made me shudder. But it wasn't that necessarily disturbed me so much. It was the other thing I saw. In the background behind the Wendigo, amongst the thick trees that lined the forest, appeared to be what looked like a staircase. The staircase didn't seem to be connected to anything. It was just by itself. My first priority was to make sure that my team was secure, but this was definitely something that we needed to look into. I readied up my second SWAT team, and I made sure I had communication to my tech team as well as my first SWAT team. We loaded into the truck, and I drove us off into the dark forest to rescue our first SWAT team. I had the radio to the first SWAT team on to make sure that our communication was open. As we started driving into the forest, we could hear gunshots off into the distance. After a few minutes of driving, we finally reached the fallen fire tower, with the other truck parked outside of it. We had to get out and hike the rest of the way. I checked in with my tech team to make sure that they were okay, and they were. I also checked in with my first SWAT team, and they told us that things were definitely trying to get in the cabin, and that we needed to hurry. And hurried, we did. The second SWAT team, led by me, started a light jog into the woods, headed for the cabin. The entire way we were jogging, we could hear gunfire coming from the direction we were running towards. We needed to make sure we got there in time. The first SWAT team radioed in frantically, telling us that it got more members of the SWAT team. I reassured them that we were only a few minutes away and not to worry. We continued jogging when we started to hear something that was unsettling. Something that I didn't think would make me feel uneasy, but it did. It was the sound of silence. The gunfire had stopped. This was not a good sign. I radioed into my first SWAT team, but no answer. I radioed into my tech team to see what had happened, but unfortunately all they had to share with us was bad news. The Wendigos had taken all of them. We were too late. The situation went from bad to worst almost instantly. I had only one SWAT team left and no reinforcements. However, we do have confirmation on a set of stairs. We just don't know where. Upon hearing the news, I ordered my second SWAT team back, and that we needed to get back to the truck as soon as we could. We then turned around and made our way back to the fire tower where we had parked our truck. As we hiked back, we got a sense of something following us. A few times my SWAT members in the back would stop and scan the area behind them, causing all of us to stop. My anxiety began to pulse in my stomach. I knew what was happening. Despite being surrounded by my SWAT team, I was completely terrified. I knew that despite being surrounded by 6 highly trained SWAT members, that they were no match against 4 Wendigos. Our only hope of surviving any of this was for us to get back to the trucks. Right before we made it to the fire tower, I could hear gunfire coming from behind us. Instead of moving forward, we all took defensive positions. This obviously slowed us down immensely. I could see briefly through the flashes of gunfire what appeared to be only one Wendigo. The creature moved impossibly fast, and as it saw that we took defensive positions and better organized, it retreated. After a few seconds of waiting, we then started our hike back to our truck. Speed was our priority at the moment. We needed to get back. We finally arrived to both trucks that were parked at the fire tower. After a quick review of either truck, we then noticed that both of them had been destroyed. All of the tires had been flattened. Parts were strewn about everywhere. The method for us to get back to our camp safely had literally been destroyed. I could see the look of defeat on all of my SWAT team. They knew that the impending doom was going to eventually overtake us, that it was only just a matter of time. Around this time, we could hear growls and roars coming from all around us. Their method of being sneaky was no longer needed. They had us where they wanted us. My SWAT team formed a small circle, with me in the center. Before we could start our long and incredibly dark hike back to our camp, we were greeted with a horrible sight. A Wendigo came from out of the woods and onto the trail, blocking our way back. It was taller than I remember, much more lean and lanky. Its features were immensely disgusting. The Wendigo was still clutching what remained of one of my SWAT team members.
"You should have never come back,"
the Wendigo said with a low growl. Upon hearing this, the majority of my SWAT team started to fire at the creature. However, the Wendigo simply threw the remains of the SWAT member at us and ran into the woods. Immediately, the 3 remaining Wendigos attacked us from all sides, essentially ambushing us. My SWAT team, as well as myself, were caught completely off guard. Our formation was completely dismantled almost instantly. It was practically every man for himself. A firefight immediately rang out in the night. Seeing that I was going to be outmanned, I had no choice but to run off into the woods, let my team distract them, and hopefully I can make it out of here. I ran for what felt like 15 minutes before I saw a familiar sight, the flash of yellow. The ghost girl from the case previously. She was pointing again. She was guiding me somewhere. Hopefully this would lead me back to my camp, I had no choice but to follow her directions. The gunfight from my team was slowly getting quieter until it was completely silent. It appeared that the Wendigos had finished all of them. However, this did give me a solid chance at escape. Hopefully I'd be far enough from the Wendigos to make it back. I would follow the directions from the girl in yellow, and she'd disappear for a bit. She would then reappear later on, giving me further directions. However, the more I followed her directions, the more I realized that there were more bodies on the path that I was going to. Where was this girl leading me to? I radioed in my tech team to see if there was any way that they could get to me. They had absolutely no idea where I was. Since I'd been following this ghost girl's directions, I had no idea where I was in this forest. However, that soon became the least of my problems, as I started to hear one of the Wendigos behind me. I was still formatted with body armor and a machine gun. However, I was still no match for a Wendigo. My tech team radioed in something quite surprising. "Johnson, we can see you on one of the body cameras. You're near the stairs." I looked around frantically with my flashlight, and sure enough, there was a set of very large stairs randomly going nowhere in the forest. However, before I could investigate, I could hear the loud sound of a Wendigo coming towards me. The ghost girl then appeared at the top of the stairs, pointing to her. I sprinted towards the stairs, but I was quickly intercepted by a Wendigo. It had knocked me over with its large body and picked me up with its sharp claws. It had knocked my machine gun out of my hands. However, I still had my pistol on me, which I quickly drew. However, before I could properly aim and fire the weapon, the Wendigo started to bite on my arm. The pain was immense, and it was a mixture between both a sharp pain and intense pressure. I could feel a warm liquid run down my arm, as the Wendigo shook me like a rag doll. My arm then became numb as I found myself flying through the air. I then had realized why the Wendigo had released me. It had taken my arm off. With all the fear, pain, and anxiety that I was experiencing, I was also feeling lightheaded. I was losing lots of blood. With no other option, I ran over to my machine gun, picked it up with my remaining arm, and found my way going up the stairs. I started to fire at the Wendigo, but the bullets hardly did anything. I just kept walking up the stairs backwards as I continued to fire. The 3 remaining Wendigos came from out of the woods and helped in the attack. When they finally reached me, I was at the top step of the stairs. I had nowhere else to go. One of the Wendigos swiped at me, and I found myself falling back off the stairs. However, something happened. Something bizarre. Instead of landing on the cold, hard earth of the night, I had landed on soft snow, and it was daytime. I still had my machine gun with me, and my arm had been restored. The stairs were still there, but the Wendigos were gone. It appeared that the stairs had led me to another place, another dimension perhaps. However, all questions were quickly answered when I saw the girl in yellow standing before me. However, this time she was no longer a ghost, but in fact a person. She looked incredibly dirty, as if she'd been living in the woods for quite some time. Before I could say anything to her, she asked me for help. She said that her father was trying to kill her because they ran out of food a couple of weeks ago and that they were forced to eat one of their own. When she caught word of what was going to happen, she ran away. I was briefly confused, but then I realized what had happened. Those stairs had sent me back in time. This was the only way I was going to defeat the Wendigos. I had to stop them from transforming in the first place. I figured if I just killed the girl and the family, that I would stop them from turning. But that seemed so wrong, even though it would essentially solve the problem. There must have been a better way. It then dawned on me what the obvious answer was. I needed to find these people some food. Seeing that I still had my machine gun, that this was completely possible. I told the little girl that everything was going to be okay, and that she needed to take me back to her cabin so that I could talk with her father. She obviously hesitated at the thought, but I reassured her that she was going to be okay. On the way back to her cabin, we saw a large deer which I shot and killed. The deer was quite heavy, but I was still able to carry it back to the cabin, although it took me much longer. Before we even knocked on the cabin door, the entire family came out and greeted us as they saw what we had. I'm pretty sure the entire family was crying as they saw that what they were about to do to their own family member. The solution was actually quite easy.
However, it was just difficult since they didn't have the proper tools for this time. I left the deer with the family, and I didn't say a word. As I headed back for the stairs, the man that I assumed to be the father introduced himself. "Hello, my name is Jedediah. Thank you for saving us." Again, I didn't say anything. I just nodded. I had seen too many time-traveling movies to know that if I messed with the timeline too much, things could have gotten worse. However, I think providing a starving family with food would be acceptable. I made it back to the stairs and I went up them. I jumped off the edge again, and I came back to what I assumed to be our time. However, when I came through, I was no longer standing in a forest, but instead, a very large town. The town wasn't terribly large, but it was incredibly beautiful. The stairs that I used twice before had now disappeared. I quickly walked around the town to see if I was in the right time period, and sure enough, I was. I walked over to where the cabin once stood, and to my surprise, the cabin was no longer there, but in its place was a town hall. In front of the town hall appeared to be some kind of statue of a man holding a deer. Below the statue on a plaque read, "This statue is to commemorate the random stranger that provided much needed food to the Williams family in 1843. I then started walking out of town, and I called my supervisor. Apparently, I forgot what time it was, and it took a couple rings before he answered. He didn't seem too terribly happy for me to call him at this hour. However, I think the news made up for it. "Sir, Operation Wendigo is a success."